Fly tying tools are important. Once you find the right one, they become friends. Like this old Thompson whip finisher. I've had it for over 40 years. Friends are that way also. The next friend you're going to meet is one I've had for at least 35 years. When I first started my fly tying operation back in 1966, Jay Buckner worked for me. He had just come from Iowa, and he was learning about trout fishing. He became a fabulous tyer, one of the best in the country. It was a pleasure to have Jay in my book, Tying Flies with Jack Dennis and Friends. And now you're going to meet Jay, and he's going to show you some of the patterns that he has made famous.
Well, I'm going to do the Snake River Muddler today. This is a fly that Joe Burke politely named on an experimental fly that I couldn't figure out a name for. I'm going to use a number 6, 4 extra long mustad hook. Any other 4 extra long streamer type hook would work just fine. This could be weighted or unweighted. I'm going to do an unweighted one. The prime ingredient for the fly is grizzly marabou, and in this case we're using some dyed yellow grizzly marabou. It's going to comprise both the tail, the body, and the wing of the fly. We'll start out by taking one fairly long, large feather and deciding on a tail, maybe a little bit bigger than the hook gap. And we'll just tie this material on like that. So it's going to be a nice little tail. We'll tie it on with 3 or 4 wraps of thread. I'm using a 3/0 monocord. Now to do the body, we take the same feather without trimming it off, and we'll hold the thread down here, and we'll kind of twist to reinforce the material, we'll kind of twist this around the thread. This will make an interesting kind of fuzzy mottled colored body. And we'll just take the whole feather and thread and wrap it forwards. And if your feather isn't quite as big as the one I'm using, you could use 2 feathers. So we get up to this point and kind of unwrap it a little bit so we can tie it down, and we'll just tie that down. Trim off a little bit of the feather stem that's sticking out here. Now this is a little fuzzier than it even needs to be, so we can trim a little bit of that off too. Now when that gets wet, that'll slick back and look like it's a little minnow in motion. Okay, for the wing, we're going to use an underwing. For an underwing, we're going to use some fox squirrel tail. Could be gray squirrel tail, but in this case we'll use fox squirrel. One of the purposes for this would be to show a little bit of a mid-body stripe, which is common in lots of little minnows and bait fish. But it also helps to keep the wing, which is a softer material, from tail wrapping when you're casting it. So we'll take some of this squirrel tail, and we'd like to extend that back just about to the end of the tail. We'll tie that on. The one thing we do need, that I didn't mention, that we do need to do is leave enough room at the head of the fly so that you can put on a deer hair head. So we probably leave in the range of 1/4 of an inch, maybe slightly more than that, for the deer hair head. Now we'll select 2 more of these dyed grizzly marabou feathers for the wing. And the way we're going to select those is so that they're nice, fairly squared off on the ends, nice even conformation, and about similar size. We'll put the 2 of those together, and we just lay those over the back of the fly. This being the wing, we could have maybe extend a little bit beyond the tail, maybe 1/4 of an inch. Now, one of the ingredients of this particular fly, or the reasons this fly was attractive to me, I said the material was attractive to me because of all the barring on it. And I've liked to look at new materials or materials that aren't being used for types of flies and figure out something they can be used for. These vertical stripes on the grizzly marabou looks an awful lot like the par markings on a small trout or the stripes on some minnow or bait fish. And I looked at that as a very much of a plus, because taking any kind of another material and making barring on it so it looks like a immature trout is pretty difficult. So this came naturally. The yellow will have a coloration similar to our cutthroats, and it works quite well as a small cutthroat trout, if you would. So we'll tie that wing on and finish it off. We'll take a whip finisher now and finish the fly at this point, or at least this step. We'll whip finish that right there. Now we'll put some glue, head cement on the junction right here. Keep this nice and tight and keep it from unraveling. Twisting, turning. We'll put some head cement right there. Okay. Now, to do the head on a muddler, this muddler or any other muddler, we'll change our thread. Now, I'll use a size A weight monocord. Doesn't have to be black, but we'll use black in this case. Could be a gray or even a yellow color. We'll attach the thread to the hook. Now, my preference for muddler minnow style flies is to have a small-headed fly. It can float, it also can sink just a little bit. I'll select some mule deer hair. It'll be long enough to do this fly, and we'll take one clump of hair. And the only way I can even recommend the amount of hair needed is experience, practice. It's very, very difficult to tell you the size of a pencil or 2 pencils and have that really come out the way you want it to, because you may prefer a large-headed muddler that's going to float more, and someone else may even prefer one that's smaller-headed than this fly. So we'll put the deer hair in a hair stacker and take our little clump of deer hair. Now, if I'm going to spin the hair on this, because I've glued this and I have a very stiff kind of hard collar where this glue is dried, if I try to just put this clump on here and spin it around, it probably won't distribute evenly. So I'm going to take my deer hair and insert it around the hook from the side. And I'll hold it with my left hand, and we'll just bring the thread around 2 loose wraps, and then tighten it. I'm going to stand the hair up as straight as I can and spiral the thread forwards through the deer hair. Getting to the eye of the hook, we'll put a little head on here and whip finish that. And then all we have to do is to trim the head down. When I was originally practicing on this particular fly and trying to find a good use for this material, I had maybe 12 or 15 different versions of this fly, with deer hair heads, without deer hair heads, all sorts of variations in a fly box. And one day while fishing, Joe Burke spied my box of experiments and chose this version. We caught fish on it, and since I didn't have a name for it, he decided it was going to be called the Snake River Muddler. It's been a very successful fly. Now, my preference for trimming these heads, as I said, I like a small-headed muddler that doesn't necessarily float too well. So I trim the head fairly tight. I trim them from the side like this so I don't get too much of the tips of the hair, and I don't have a tendency to make it too tapered. couple trips around to make it even, and there, the finished snake river muddler.